Hello, my name is Henry Silverman, and today I would like to talk about the ethical issues in social, behavioral, and educational research. Social and behavioral research involves the study of social and behavioral human functioning at the individual, small group, institution, or community levels. It involves the study of behavioral factors such as thought processes, personality, and emotion. Such research involves a search for general principles of behavioral and social functioning. Common data gathering methods are shown in this slide. It may involve observation of individuals, interviews of participants, focus group discussions, surveys and questionnaires, ethnographic research, physiological manipulations and recordings, laboratory and field experiments, standardized tests, economic analysis, and statistical modeling. There has been examples of unethical research in the past. One involved Milgram's obedience to authority study. His experiments began in July 1961, 3 months after the start of the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. Milgram devised his psychological study to answer the popular question at that particular time: could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? His study involved a recruitment of subjects who were told that they will be teachers in a grammar exercise. Teachers and learners would be in separate rooms. The learners were actors who were involved with the purpose of the research. The teachers were made to believe that they were administering electric shocks to the learners every time the learners gave a wrong answer. At various times in the experiment, the teachers would receive prompts from the investigator to keep on continuing giving the shocks, at which time the teachers could decide to follow the command or not. The results of the experiment showed that 65% of the teacher participants administered the experimental's final massive 450-volt shock, though many were made uncomfortable in doing so. Milgram concluded that the majority of the participants obeyed commands to hurt other people. This research was controversial because many commentators considered the experiment harmful because it caused permanent psychological damage and caused people to be less trusting in the future. Another example of a controversial research occurred in 1960 with the tea room trade study, involving a study of homosexual sex in public toilets. Lord Humphreys, a sociologist, recognized that the public and the law enforcement authorities held highly simplistic stereotype beliefs about men who commit impersonal sexual acts with one another in public restrooms, so-called tea room sex, which accounted for the majority of homosexual arrests in the United States. Humphreys decided that it would be of considerable social importance for society to gain more objective understanding of who these men are and what motivates them to seek quick and personal sexual gratification. Humphreys set out to answer this question by means of participant observation and structured interview. He stationed himself in tea rooms and offered to serve as the watch queen, that is, the individual who keeps watch and coughs when a police car stops nearby or a stranger approaches. He played that role faithfully while observing hundreds of sex acts. He was able to gain the confidence of some of the men he observed and persuaded them to tell him about the rest of their lives and about their motives. Humphreys' findings destroyed many stereotypes. 54% of his subjects were married and living with their wives, and his analysis suggested that they were exemplary citizens. Humphreys' research helped persuade police departments to stop using the resources on arrests for this victimless crime. However, many were concerned with the loss of privacy with this research. One of the most important and challenging tasks that investigators face is identifying and evaluating risks associated with participation in social behavioral research. Unlike biomedical research studies or clinical trials in which the sources of risk may be more readily identifiable and quantifiable, risks associated with participation in social and behavioral science research are often more elusive and less predictable. However, this does not mean that these risks are any less serious or less real. For example, discrimination due to an inadvertent disclosure of sensitive personal information such as sexual orientation or a diagnosis of mental illness could have serious consequences. In rare circumstances, the risks associated with such research may be physical in nature. For example, those who study victims of domestic violence need to consider that the subjects may become the victims of retaliatory violence from their partners. It is also possible that when groups or communities rather than individuals are the focus of a study, the group as a whole may be at risk of harm. For example, studies comparing the average IQ of quote-unquote racial groups or the prevalence of HIV-infected individuals in communities may stigmatize the community being studied. The primary sources of social risk results from invasion of privacy, breach of confidentiality, and from the study procedures itself. The right of the individual to privacy is a preeminent ethical principle in Western society. Privacy involves the right of individuals to maintain control over his or her physical and mental access to themselves and over information about themselves. Invasions of privacy can occur if personal information is accessed or collected without the subject's knowledge or consent. Invasions of privacy can occur if a subject's participation in the study is revealed without the subject's knowledge. For example, if an investigator communicates via email with subjects in a study about recovering from childhood sexual assault, family members with access to email may learn about the assault. On the other hand, confidentiality is concerned with who has the right of access to the data that have been provided by the participants. Privacy and confidentiality concepts are frequently misunderstood. So, how does one distinguish between privacy and confidentiality? Well, a helpful mnemonic is to always equate P with person for privacy issues, and C represents keeping the data secure. Risk may also emanate from the procedures in the research. That is, simply participating in the research can cause social or psychological harm. There may be psychological reaction to the situation, and there may be psychological reaction to the questions. For example, responding to questions about a sensitive topic or traumatic event may be distressing to a subject, even if the information divulged is kept in strict confidence. Finally, participants may inadvertently reveal confidential information to others in a focus group discussion. This slide shows the types of risk in social research. There are the social risks that we just discussed, and psychological risks, but there may also be economic risks, legal risks, physical risks, and harms to others. As in biomedical research, risks in social behavioral research may be minimal risk or less, or greater than minimal risk. Examples of minimal risk research include surveys and interviews in which any disclosure does not put the participants at risk, studies involving MRIs and EEG to study brain functions, and the collection of tissue samples, for example from the cheek, to measure cortisol levels as indicators of stress. Greater than minimal risk research could involve identification and responses that place individuals at risk, studies involving deceptions, manipulation of subjects' emotions, and threats of harms from or to third parties. This slide showed the different aspects of risks. When assessing risks associated with participation in a research study, There are two distinct elements of risk that need to be considered. One is the probability of harm, the likelihood that a specific harm might occur. Essentially, not all possible harms are equally probable, and this fact should be taken into consideration when assessing risk. The second element of risk is the magnitude of such harm. Sometimes there is great disparity between the probability and the magnitude of harm in a study. For example, a researcher wants to do a web-based survey of college students to elicit information about their sexual behavior and drug use. Identifiers will not be collected. However, the data are vulnerable in transit from an individual's PC to the web server hosting the survey, much in the same way that credit card information is vulnerable during transit. Although the probability that such data could be snatched in transit and identified is low, it could be done. However, the magnitude of the possible harm is very high given the sensitivity of the information. Risk and research participation are also specific to time, situation, and culture. Thus, what may be socially sensitive issues or topic at one time or place may not be so at another time or place. For example, asking women if they have had abortions would carry very different risks in a country where abortion is a routine medical practice as compared to a country where it is illegal, and compared to a country in which it is legal but the issue is fraught with religious and political controversy. Risks will also differ according to the subject population. For example, a study on the efficacy of a behavioral intervention for smoking cessation that involves both adults and teenagers. Risks may differ between adults and teenagers in this study. To enhance confidentiality protection in research, investigators must recognize confidentiality issues in the initial study design, in the identification, recruitment, and consent processes for the study population, must also recognize issues in security, analysis, and final disposition of the data, and also recognize issues involving publication or dissemination of the data and results. This slide shows the ways in which one could minimize risk regarding data disclosure. First, one could remove all direct identifiers as soon as possible, substitute codes for identifiers, maintain code lists and data files in separate secure locations, use accepted methods to protect against indirect identification, such as aggregate reporting or pseudonyms, use and protect computer passwords, encrypt stored data, access and store data on computers without internet connections, and obtain certificates of confidentiality by the National Institutes of Health. Such certificates protect identifiable research information from forced disclosure, for example, from the courts. One could also consider obtaining a waiver of the documentation of consent from the IRB. An IRB may waive the requirement for the investigator to obtain a signed consent form for some or all subjects if it finds that the principal risks are those associated with a breach of confidentiality concerning the subject's participation in the research, and the consent document is the only record linking the subject with the research. A waiver of documentation of consent does not imply that any of the required elements of consent are waived. Other ways to minimize risks are shown in this slide. Regarding privacy, it might be necessary to find ways to guard against subjects being observed participating in the study. For example, if an investigator is conducting a case study of a gang member, it may be necessary to find places to meet where other members of the gang could not observe the interaction. Subjects may also be placed at risk by the nature of the inquiry. Studies on strategies for recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, may involve a complete assessment of the nature and impact of the trauma. In research that has the potential to be distressing to the subjects, investigators need to plan appropriate resources such as supportive counseling, referral, or access to appropriate research staff. Benefit In social behavioral research refers to any sort of favorable outcome of the research to society or to the individual. In practice, benefit often stands for the combined probabilities and magnitudes of several possible favorable outcomes. This slide shows the different types of benefits in social research. It could involve physical benefits, psychological benefits, economic benefits, and benefits to science and society. There is a continuing of different IRB reviews based on the level of potential risk. Essentially, low-risk studies could go, depending on the category, either through the exempt or expedited route. To be clear, exempt research does not mean that it involves research that should not be reviewed by the IRB. All research must be reviewed by the IRB. However, the chair or his or her designee in reviewing the research may decide that if the research fits into one of the exempt categories, then such research does not need full IRB review and does not need further continuing review, whereas expedited research simply means that the research does not need to be reviewed by the full IRB, but investigators need to submit continuing review reports. This slide shows the different categories of exempt research that is exempt from full board review and continuing review. The first four of the exemptions will be most appropriate for social science research. This includes research in educational settings involving normal educational practices, research involving educational tests, surveys, interviews, or observation of public behavior, unless the participants are identified and it contains sensitive information, research using existing data, documents, records, pathological specimens, or diagnostic specimens if publicly available or unidentifiable, research involving the use of educational tests, survey procedures, interview procedures, or observation of public behavior that is not exempt under paragraph B of this section if the human subjects are elected public officials, appointed public officials, or candidate for public office. Finally, the last two categories involves evaluation of public benefit service programs and taste and food quality evaluation and consumer acceptance studies. So, one question: does this mean that all questionnaire, educational tests, and interview-based studies are exempt? No. Such studies are exempt unless specific individual subjects can be identified directly or through identifiers linked to them, and disclosure of their responses could place them at risk of criminal, civil liability, or damage to their financial standing, employability, or reputation. Also, exempt research cannot be classified as such if it involves vulnerable populations. This slide shows categories for expedited review. It includes clinical studies that does not require an IND or an IDE, blood sample collection involving small amounts, prospective collection of biological samples through non-invasive means, or data collected through non-invasive means routinely practiced in clinical settings. Research may also involve materials that have been collected or will be collected for non-research purposes, collection of voice, video, or digital data for research purposes, and research involving individual or group behavior, survey, interviews, or oral histories. The next few slides compare characteristics of exempt and expedited review. Both categories need to be equal or less than minimal risk. Exempt research does not include identifiers, whereas expedited review research may include identifiers. Exempt research does not involve sensitive topics, whereas in expedited review, if it involves sensitive topics, there needs to be secure means of protecting the data. exempt research does not involve vulnerable populations, whereas expedited research may involve vulnerable populations, but there must be adequate protections. For exempt research, informed consent may be, from a regulatory point of view, be not required, but ethically subjects deserve the right to know about such research. In expedited research, one may consider a formal informed consent process or justify a waiver of consent. In exempt research, as mentioned before, such research is exempt from continuing review, whereas expedited research requires IRB continuing review, at least annually. Exempt research must fit one of the 6 categories, whereas expedited review must fit one of the 9 expedited categories. The next few slides will address specific ethical issues in social research. This slide shows aspects of sound qualitative research. First, it emphasizes particular contexts and settings. Its rigor cannot be judged based on sample size alone. Should provide sufficient detailed account or analysis to enable others to determine the application of the findings to other circumstances. That said, it may not necessarily be generalizable. This slide shows aspects of sound qualitative research. First, it emphasizes particular contexts and settings. Its rigor cannot be judged based on sample size alone. Should provide sufficient detailed account or analysis to enable others to determine the application of the findings to other circumstances. That said, it may not necessarily be generalizable to other settings. And such research should be assessed by quality and credibility of the data collection and analysis, and not by the validity and reliability of the data. Qualitative research may involve development of personal relationships to collect data, and researchers should describe in the proposal any anticipated impact on this nature. Social science research may involve deception. Deception in research involves lying to or intentionally misleading subjects. It may be important in some research to withhold the specific purpose of the research from subjects in order not to bias. Deception potentially poses ethical problems and should be dealt with by weighing the benefits of the research against the harm, if any, from the deception. Aside from any potential harm to participants, deception can also harm the institution by building the perception among potential subjects and future subjects that researchers are liars. Also, deception may sever the trust between society and the research enterprise. Any research involving deception must include adequate debriefing exercises after the research. Social behavioral research may involve illegal activities. One must establish that the risks are justified by the benefits of the research, that is, the risk from disclosure of illegal activities. To prevent this, one may use pseudonyms or remove links between names and data, all of which should be explained in the protocol. One should also explain how the researcher will keep confidential any illegal activity. And one should also explain who has access to confidential information and threats to confidentiality. Research about Aboriginal groups or tribes may be controversial. Investigators need to ensure that the research has relevance to the community concerns, that the research methods are respectful of the local cultures. There must be evidence of support from the relevant cultural communities. One must identify the potential negative consequences of the research. And one must obtain agreement with local groups about appropriate recruitment techniques, the obtainment of what is suitable information about the research, and appropriate reporting of the results. Privacy issues regarding the informed consent process are shown in this slide. It mainly involves recruitment issues. For example, how does a researcher gain access to a database of probable research participants? Was there an invasion of privacy in obtaining such a database? And what recruitment methods are being used? For example, personal contact, recruiters, or does it involve power relationships between researchers and participants? This slide shows issues involved with the consent process in social science research. Subjects need to be aware of all the psychosocial and economic risks attached to the research. If questions will be of sensitive nature, subjects need to be forewarned. They also need to know the full disclosure of confidentiality risks. For example, who will have access to the database and what steps will be taken to protect the data. And they also need to know any limits to the extent to which a researcher can protect identifiable data. Some research may involve obtaining information about third parties. Third parties are persons about whom information is derived from primary subjects. In such research, consent also needs to be obtained from these third parties. So, in conclusion, social research requires technical rigor and ethical soundness and analysis in order to protect the rights and welfare of the study subjects. Thank you very much.